it was brought up by the news media of your dad's refusal to pay the grazing permits on that. And it seemed like he claimed he wanted to pay the state rather than can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, so what ultimately happened was, it's a long history, but we go back to, I'll try to sum it up into really tight, but you gotta go back to 1934, the Taylor Grazing Act. That's when the federal government came in and said, all these ranchers were kind of, some of them were in conflict, some of them were basically ranching, but none of their borders were defined. So they were overlapping each other and they were having some troubles. And rather than the state doing it, which should have been their responsibility, the federal government came in and said, well, we're going to draw boundaries and work with the ranchers and get these boundaries set. Well, once they did that, and they got the ranchers together and they all kind of defined this happened all over the West. All over the West. This didn't just happen in Nevada, but happened all over the West. And ultimately, the ranchers did all somewhat agree, and they decide, just end up having their boundaries to their ranches. But the federal government decided to go a step further. And remember, when we're talking about the federal government, back then we're talking about the land office and the grazing board. Now, what was the purpose of the land office, the federal land office? Anybody know? It was to get the land and the resources into the people's hands. That was our whole purpose, to get the people using the land and the resources. That was the whole design. And what was the purpose of the grazing board, the U.S. Grazing Board? It was to get ranchers out there grazing and using the land and claiming the land for grazing. So that's kind of how they got involved. And at this point, it should have been the state, but the federal government did it. And then they said, well, let's put together a joint fund where the ranchers will pay so much per cow. They call it an AUM, right? They still call it it. And it'll go into what they call an improvement fund. And then the ranchers can take that and they'll decide themselves in the board. They'll decide how they're going to use it, but they need to use it for improvements like fences. So they can make fences and they can make some roads and they can also put some water troughs and some improvements. That's what it was for. And that, for all the ranchers or anybody who understands, that over years became deteriorated and perverted until now it became what we call a grazing permit. And it was never, ever intended to be used the way it is now. The federal government and those ranchers knew that that was their ranch. They had rights to those ranches. But through this process and generational gaps, the federal government began to claim it. And then say, now you've got to sign a permit and we're leasing it to you. And that was a process that happened over about 2.5 generations. Well, so to answer your question, at the Bundy Ranch, that same thing happened. But then the federal government comes down in the late 1980s and says to my dad, we're going to close your allotment because we want to make it an endangered species mitigation area for the desert tortoise. We're going to close it, so no longer can you ranch there. And my dad's going, wait a minute. I mean, I have these deeds. It's been in my family longer than 70 years longer than the Bureau of Land Management even existed. And other ranches, the same things are happening to other ranchers in that area. And they're starting to go, well, what's going on here? Like, where are our rights? And that's where they began to research and understand that of what happened and unwind what happened. And so at some point, my dad, it was right around 1990, right around in that time, he begins to make a stand. And he says, look, if I'm going to pay somebody to use my ranch, I'm certainly not going to pay the federal government. They do not have jurisdiction or authority to hear. He goes, so if there's some public entity that I'm supposed to pay to use my ranch and my rights, then I'll pay the county. That's the closest government. And so he took the exact same amount that he would pay for, I think, a 10-year period, and he paid it to the county. And the county actually took it, deposited it, and then they realized what he's doing, and they're like, we don't know what to do with this money. And then that's when my dad took a stand. He said, this ranch is my ranch. But the thing is there was no grazing fee because they'd already closed the allotment. So the grazing fee and not paying that was actually a lie that the media spun. Because according to the federal government, the allotment was already closed. So does that answer your question? I know there's a lot. I packed 3 generations of stuff in that explanation.
How did you continue grazing it then if it wasn't a permit anymore?
We put our cows on there and they ate the grass.
That's what I thought.
And my dad had a right to do that. How do you explain the deeds, the grazing right deeds of the state of Nevada? That's where the conflict came in, because we have those just kind of to explain those deeds. And my dad's done this before. You can sell them, you can trade them, you can go to the bank and borrow money on them, as collateral, and you can inherit them. They are real property. And the federal government wanted to act like they weren't. And in fact, what they were trying to do and what they have done to almost all the land users in the West is they have taken the rights of the people to the land and to the resources and transferred them into a privilege. They claim that they own it and they only give you a privilege to use it. Well, if you go to almost any ranch, any allotment, if you will, I can go show you where the original rights to graze are tied to a certain property or a certain water. Those are deeded rights that the federal government took from us.